All right, so in my lab demo for this morning, lab 6, some new functions. They're pretty easy to use. We'll go over them quickly. Things that you need to know out of the chapter are about hyperlinks and 3D formulas. Those are pretty straightforward. And then the new things I want to introduce are data tables, Goldseek, and Scenario Manager. The assignment due at the beginning of next lab is the tutorials, case problems 1 through 3. And then I've got an additional one that covers the new stuff that's not in the textbook. And it's on the next sheet over in the workbook here. Other than that, it's a case like you're used to using. There's a file out there you open, and here's the questions you do, and you put them in that workbook, and then you just hand that workbook in too, like all the other ones. All right? Okay. I'm in the process of grading the exam 1, and a lot of you had problems understanding the difference between round, round down, and just displaying some number. If I were to take a number like 123.123 and tell you to round that off to the nearest integer, so many of you did this trick, but that's not the right answer. All that does is change how the thing is displayed. It does not change the underlying value. That's still what's stored there. So that's the stored value, and then there's the displayed value. And so if you really want to round something off, you've got to use one of the round functions. Well, round function would be the easiest one, and there's some other ones you can use like that. Okay, let's go through these first. So here's a number. And if I just want to round it off to a certain number of decimal places, I just tell it to round it off like that. Take that number in C1 and round it off to 2 places to the right of the decimal. But down here, notice I told it to format it to 4 decimal places. That's why you see those 2 trailing zeros. So that works just like the rounding rule that you learned way back in grade school. Round up rounds up to whatever. If I had like round up C3, 0 or C11, 0, that says nothing to the right of the decimal, so that would round it up to the next whole number. And then there's a round down, which no matter how big the number is, it'll round it down to that number of decimal places. And then truncation does exactly the same thing. You can tell it to simply throw away everything to the right of that decimal. And then integer function, when you're in a hurry and you just want the integer part, you can do that. All right. So when the problem says round up or round off or round down, don't display it. Do it that way. Okay? One other function that falls into this category is the mod function. And the mod function returns the remainder in a division. Remember back when you were in grade school and they said 5 divided by 3, and you said, well, that's 1 with a remainder of 2, right? Well, that's what the mod does. It returns the remainder part. So you can set it up like this. And it just says divide the first argument by the second one and return the remainder. Okay. Now, why in the heck would I want that? Well, it's a handy little function to have from time to time because there's some things that you want to do with it. For example, here's a date time string, right? And we know that that's the displayed value and there's the stored value. And we know that the stuff to the left of the decimal is the number of days since January 1st, 1900. And what's to the right of the decimal is the fraction of a day that time represents, right? So 8 o'clock is 1/3 of the day. So that's why it's 0.3333. So I got a whole column of those date timestamps, and I need to extract the hour part. Well, then I could just do a trick like this, where I just tell it to divide by 1 and return the remainder. So that essentially gives me everything to the right of the decimal. And so now I have the time in its own separate column, and I can do whatever I want to do with it here. In this case here, I told it to format it as time, and over here, I simply told it to leave the format off so I could see the raw value, so I could do whatever I want to do with it. So again, displayed value, stored value. So that's a handy trick for whatever purposes. Now, a couple other things you can do with the mod function. I've only got about 100 rows here, but suppose this was 20,000 rows and maybe 50, 60 columns, say. All right, big piece of data. And I want to do some stuff with it. Well, I use conditional formatting here to just highlight every 4th row to make it easier for me to read the data and stuff like that. I didn't, just it's a trick. You can do that like this. Let's see if I can make this work. I went like that and that, right? You've seen that trick, right? I've shown you that trick. Okay, so I selected all that stuff. I went to conditional formatting. I said manage rules. I said create a new rule. And it looks like I got it in here twice. So let's get rid of, I can delete that one, and I can delete that one, and I'll create this again. It's a new rule, like that. And then I can say here equals the mod of, if I do this, row, like that, that returns what row number of it that I'm in at that current spot. So each time it goes down there, it'll figure out if it's in row 23, 24, 25. And then we can say mod, comma, 4, if that equals 0. So every time that's a true statement, then do some sort of conditional formatting. And so in here, I would just say format like this. And then I just picked a color, I don't know, something like that. Well, let's see, we'll just do that one. And I got that. Okay. So again, there's this, you won't use it every day, but it's a nice little function. And the last one, I was looking around, and I found a real-life example. Guy literally had a spreadsheet that had 20,000 rows in it, and he was an accountant, and he said that the column sums should all have an integer. There should be nothing to the right of the decimal, and he discovered that one of his columns had something inherent in it. So that meant that someplace in that 20,000 rows in that particular column, somebody had messed up. So how do you find that quickly? Well, the trick that he used was he came over and created a new column, and he just said, I'll use the mod function, and it'll put a 0 here if it's an integer, and it'll put a 1 there, or it'll put something above 1 or 0 if somebody typed a number in. And sure enough, here's the number. Now, the next step he did, I'll skip that because I'm running out of time here, is he turned this into a filter table, and then he just said, show me those rows that had something bigger than 0 in that column, and he saw them right away, and he was done. It took him about 2 minutes to find those bad numbers. So actually 2 in here. So that's, again, a lot of Excel is just knowing what the functions are and being a little bit clever when you want to apply them. So any questions about mod? All right, last thing, random numbers. We'll be using those from time to time this semester. There's 2 kinds. There's ran between, which generates an integer between the low value and the high value, the first value and the second value. So that one there says generate a random number between 1 and 100. And that's great. Now, and then the second type is rand like that, and that says generate a random real between 0 and 0.9999 repeating, or 0 and 1, we commonly say. Okay. And so we can use that to generate all sorts of numbers. We can stick them in a spreadsheet. We can analyze them. We can do all sorts of interesting things with them. I use it all the time when I make up data for my exams, and so on and so forth. Now, you can take this a little bit further. If I need numbers in some range besides 0 through 1, for real, say, well, I can do a couple of tricks. This first trick here is I just multiply that number by 10. So in effect, I'll generate a random number between 0 and 10. So, whatever I multiply by, that'll be my big range. Now, if I don't necessarily want the thing to start at 0, then I can just add an adjustment to it. And so here, I'm generating a random number between a -5 and a +5. And again, just between those two things. So the first, if you multiply times the range that you want, and then you put in a -5 says to start at a -5. If I put +10 there, it says start the range at +10, and so on and so forth. Okay. So you can use that to generate all sorts of numbers. Questions about random numbers? Okay, last thing you need to know then about that. In Excel, the default setup says that every time you make a change to a sheet, to automatically update all formulas. That's nice. We like that because, if I were to come in here and change, this number to whatever, right? Say I decided that should be 266 and not 166. Then I want that summation at the bottom, that sum function at the bottom, to reflect that new number automatically. I don't want to have to force it to recalculate everything. Okay, so that's what we want. But the reason why I bring that up now is that it causes these random. That's a formula, right? That's a formula. That's a formula. That's a formula. So every time I make a change to the workbook, like put a number in a cell someplace, it updates all the formulas so these random numbers change. So oftentimes when you want to generate a series of random numbers, you'll generate them once like that, and then you'll copy them and paste just the values so that they don't keep changing on it all the time, so that you can test your formulas to make sure they're right, because every time you make a change to the workbook, you don't want to have to go back and recalculate every, is the change because I changed my formula or because I got different random numbers? All right, so questions about random numbers? Okay, pretty simple stuff, I think. On P1, you're supposed to generate some random numbers and then mess around with them with different kinds of trunk functions and stuff like that. All right, so go ahead and start working on that.